Corey Rice, Director of Strategy at KORTX. How you doing today?
Hello. How's it going?
Good, man. Thanks for jumping on. As part of our commitment and our focus on empowering transformative growth, we wanted to open up a conversation to share with all of our customers and anybody that might follow KORTX into a very, very popular topic right now. Has been popular, will continue to be popular, which is talking about cookie deprecation and alternative IDs, specifically within the programmatic ecosystem. So Corey, you are hands down probably the most involved in a lot of these conversations with our customers, our internal team members. Would love just to kind of get your initial thoughts on any trends that you see that are going on right now and just where people are really spending their time, what they're focused on, what they're concerned about, and maybe some advice that you're giving them.
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of notice that the folks that we're working with fall into a handful of buckets. I think we see some that are being very proactive about, preparing for the inevitable, even though we've been waiting for 3 or 4 years now for some change to come down, but it is going to happen. And so, we do see a lot of clients trying to be proactive about, how they can prepare themselves for really to give themselves an advantage eventually when cookie deprecation does come on a larger scale. But surprisingly enough, I think there's many that are in kind of a wait and see mode because, ultimately it comes down to a handful of industry leading companies that have the size and the clout to be able to really make an impact when it comes to cookie deprecation. So what we've been doing along the way is looking at ways where we can help KORTX clients really just be proactive about preparing now. Because while we are still, certain amount of time away from it having a major impact on digital marketing in the ecosystem, we find that there's a handful of things that clients can start doing right now that's going to give them an advantage as these things do start to escalate.
And Corey, I know we're sitting here at a point in time right now where we started with Privacy Sandbox. There's been a few iterations on that sense and other ways to look at how we can possibly leverage the Google ecosystem to have some form of personalized audience targeting. We also look at commercial identifiers, obviously the large battle between Ramp ID, Trade Desk, and kind of the UID 2.0. We have a continued evolution in terms of those bigger players that you're talking about that are trying to figure out who's going to be the forerunner of this. I saw a great article the other day, someone that kind of framed it as, we are going into a political election here. It seems that the trade desks of the world and the live ramps are doing the same thing. It's who's going to go out and kind of win the hearts and minds of marketers and get them to believe that their ID is the right alternative to a cookie. So with that, I know we have a lot of folks that are really interested. We've developed our own cookieless testing framework just to outline some of those opportunities to test. But I believe there's a study that came out from 33 Across that basically said that marketers are largely not testing alternative options to cookies. So for anybody that is looking to take a step forward and maybe some easy steps, what would your advice be to get moving in that direction to at least have a little bit of momentum as we carry into the spring and summer here?
Yeah, so there's a handful of things that we recommend. And, just to take a step back on the testing piece, testing and learning has always been a component of our industry, right? And how you understand what's working for your brand, what isn't working for your brand. I think when it comes to cookie deprecation, you just have to think about it in a little bit of a different context of you have a head start right now, right? So any learnings that can be brought specific to the industry vertical that you operate in, the brands that you're working with are going to play to your advantage. But we put together a little list here of a handful of things that we feel like proactively can start doing right now. They're going to provide an advantage. And we might not be able to do all of them, but any combination of these we feel like is a great way to start. To your point, not knowing what the end game is going to be, but that it's going to be here eventually. So I'll just go through a couple of things here, Chris. The first is building out a first party data foundation. And we know that a lot of brands and agencies have already had a strong focus on first party data, but it goes beyond just, simple retargeting and some of the basics that I think a lot of brands have in place. And, thinking about ways that you're collecting first party data, storing it, how you're segmenting it, right? Looking at different ways to create customer segments, and even enriching it, right? So being able to take, let's say, a CRM list that maybe hasn't been scrubbed in a few years and making sure that that's up to date and accurate and adding additional attributes to that. So building out a first party data foundation, in my opinion, is one of the most important things that brands and agencies can be doing right now. That's going to set the stage for everything else that we're going to talk about here.
Corey, I think you add a comment there. Take first party data. It's oftentimes it can be a bit cumbersome for people to try and figure out what's the best way to leverage their own data sets as a brand or as an agency. How do you get your customers comfortable allowing access to that or using it for marketing campaigns? You look at, again, within the walled ecosystems, custom audiences have been a feature for years now. Being able to upload a list and being able to remarket and build models off of that within platforms. To have that same mindset for really the open internet, these are concepts that are not necessarily new by any means, to your point. These are tried and true tactics that can be employed today and at least allow you to start understanding what the scale of your audiences could be, what's the effectiveness of it, and largely beginning to understand, are there maybe possibly insights from those audiences that would allow you to deploy different strategies down the road. Could be learning a little bit more about the interests and behaviors of an audience, and now I leverage that for, let's say, a contextual buy or a pub direct buy.
Exactly. And you're right. You're absolutely right, Chris. It's not just about activating and targeting first party audiences. It's gleaning as many insights as possible to learn as much as you can about your potential and current customers right now while those mechanisms are in place, because they can inform other strategies that aren't directly related to just gathering first party data and then targeting against it.
And in the spirit of the fast-paced world of digital advertising, Eric Lee, thank you for joining, COO of KORTX. I think you're coming in from another meeting, but we're chatting here with Corey just about what he's hearing on the street around cookie deprecation. So, Eric, please feel free to chime in at any time with any thoughts you have.
I do think, just quickly to set the stage slightly, it's helpful to understand why we're talking about this. And so in my mind, I do a little bit of storytelling just to say, how did we get here? And so in my opinion, I got to start with, so picture this, we're in 1994. We've got Lion King, Forrest Gump battling out the box office. We've got Ace of Base dominating the top 40. But then lesser news, you have a company, Netscape, that most of us probably aren't thinking a ton about, at least lately. But this is where this all stems from. You have a group there that has a lot of traffic. The early days of the internet, we see all these stats going up. We've got the old counter going up. But the question gets asked, how many of these folks are coming back? And from there, they kind of start to set the stage for what the cookie becomes. And so the cookie gets rolled out, they get to use it, and it says, all right, Corey came to the site, he was hit number one, he's left, but he's come back, and now I have a better understanding of what's happening traffic-wise. And we've seen how that explodes. So it starts there, but it gets used to have a better functioning internet. It lets us kind of keep track of user state. So again, if I'm adding something to my cart, it stays there when I go to the other pages, and then expands broadly. And so advertising, it really becomes a foundational piece of that. And so Corey, you talked about a lot of that in terms of like the insights and understanding our audience. And so we were kind of spoiled with the sense of, I now have an uncanny ability to kind of segment my users and target them. And I also have every metric I can dream of in terms of measuring those folks. And so while before I had to have like a strong intuition, now I was able to kind of build on these personas and say, here are other sites they've gone to. Here are the actions they've taken once they get to my website. And so, Corey, you kind of nailed it. There's a portion here where we have to go back to kind of the fundamentals and say, how do we learn from these insights while we have them and all the historic data we have, whether that's first or third party, make sure we truly understand our audience, where they're coming from, what their makeup is, and then figure out where these gaps really start to show themselves in terms of, if I can't just scroll through an endless taxonomy anymore and pick any attribute I want and target them, what were the kind of key indicators of this audience? And is it something that I need to target contextually? Or is it something that I have authenticated traffic for, whether that's from my website or the CRM? And again, it's that whole blocking and tackling of filling those gaps, knowing that I don't have the easy button anymore. And I've got to be a little bit more sophisticated with my targeting now.
Yeah, I think it was easy to get complacent with a lot of the technologies that have been put into place over the last, let's say 8 to 10 years, particularly with programmatic, where you kind of you get it dialed in and you find the best practices for your brand and your campaigns. And there, really you just had to keep up with technology at that point and make sure that you were incorporating, new partners and new capabilities and things like that. But I think that's a great point, Eric, is that now we're almost working backwards. Right. And so, one of the things that we talk a lot about with our client partners at KORTX is when it comes to the concept of just testing and learning, historically, it may be testing some different creative units, right? Does creative A work different than creative B or whatever it might be? I think there's an opportunity to get a little bit more pointed about how we're looking at, suggesting testing budgets and almost working backwards from a hypothesis, right? Because there is a lot of variance between brands and industries and verticals. And so from a testing and learning standpoint, I think it's really important to almost work backwards from a hypothesis, right? Like for our brand and our marketing strategy, we feel it's very important. Contextual is going to be an important component moving forward, right? So don't be afraid to allocate some of that budget to a testing environment or scenario that's going to allow you to prove that hypothesis, right? About contextual, or even things like maybe bringing on partners that you wouldn't have brought on in the past because they have a unique capability. But for me, the biggest takeaway is I think, brands have to get a little bit more comfortable with allowing those budgets to be allocated to testing campaigns, because the more you can learn now, the more it's going to pay off in the future. And it's not just learning about what works, it's about learning about what doesn't work, right? Because you can eliminate those components that aren't conducive to success as early as possible. And so I think there's just so much that can be gleaned from a very well-structured testing scenario when you go into it with trying to answer a specific question or prove or disprove a specific hypothesis.
Well, if we go back, Corey, to maybe our marketing capstone days for a lot of us, and we're talking about the 4 Ps and looking at a marketing mix, there's an element, Eric, you touched on it. Corey, you're talking a lot about how we can get into it, but the good old days of product, price, place, and promotion, I think if you're looking at a business strategy and you want to pull in the role of marketing, you can then start to use your marketing mix to think about how that could tell a story across a range of digital advertising channels. And I can now think of the way that I want to engage a customer at certain portions of the journey, their engagement with my brand. If I'm looking at a certain product or service, each media type and each ad platform has an appropriate role in that journey and messaging across the way. And I don't think that necessarily always needs to be on a one-to-one. I mean, there's a lot of really great tools that will live well beyond cookie deprecation and what's going to happen, that if we all as marketers, going back to the core of what we are attempting to do here, we're trying to connect our brands and our brand partners with their end consumers, create a meaningful relationship, and stop thinking about it as just putting pixels in front of somebody to drive a behavior in that moment. Relationship-based marketing is still, I think, such an important piece that a lot of us get caught up in. And I think it's natural because there are so many like very granular tools. Anybody who's ever been inside of a DSP or a DMP and is looking at audience options, you can layer on any combination of third-party segments, and you believe that you have the most precise campaign that anyone has ever created. In our reality, what is the quality and the accuracy of that data? What is the likely output of it? We've all been through a lot of those reps. So I think for a lot of people that this is a bit of a welcome change. It's a bit of a refresh in terms of how we're approaching the overall marketing process and the methodology that advertising and digital advertising plays within that. Eric, I asked your opinion for a second. I mean, you mentioned it coming in and talking about cookies and trying to create a better user experience. There's the publisher side of this, that there's a lot of different approaches that are going on right now, but I don't think the publishers are obviously oftentimes in the programmatic ecosystem maybe being their voices maybe being heard as much, or we're thinking about the impact on what this will do to publishers. What's your take on that as you work pretty closely with a lot of our supply side partnerships?
I think, a couple of ways to approach this, but the publishers are probably one of the biggest building blocks, if anything, in this whole shift. And so if you think of the internet as it operates right now, like one of the big benefits is it is an open and largely free internet. And so advertising as a whole could have allowed for that to happen. And so like they have a huge lift. There's a lot of change that's happening for them in terms of how they're monetizing their pages, able to handle kind of the overhead to keep new articles, new content come out, all while juggling, again, kind of hinted at like this monetization part of this, but like how they integrate and allow people to target that. So a portion of it is them kind of, we're talking about the basics, understanding their audience. And so you're going to see them kind of like outwardly selling that persona. I mean, they do now, but even more so because we're able to get lazy with the technology and just be part of an exchange. And it's like, all right, well, it just becomes part of deal flow. Whereas now I think you'll probably see kind of more strategics line up. And so it's like, all right, I'm going to go and connect directly with this brand. Our target audience and our readership and viewers aligns with that really well. And that's where you get into like, how do they integrate ID or topics or clean room? So Corey, you've asked me about like, where do clean rooms fit in all of this? And again, there's kind of a shuffling of the cards in terms of the ad tax that's at play. And so again, I always kind of circle back to this endless taxonomy that I could scroll. And we largely were just picking out of that. And we were kind of paying that fee to say, all right, that is my user. Now I have to do a bit more due diligence. The publisher is a big piece of that. And whether it's through a DSP or directly, like I think you'll see a lot more planning going directly into what these pubs are. So again, regardless of what that ID is, or if a clean room's in place, I can kind of streamline some of that targeting with or without the ID. I can streamline some of the measurement, but it does become a bit more disparate. And so you have the overhead shift to where like before I just had the one pixel and I kind of got the count. I know there's so many conversions I have. I kind of have to look at this differently across channels and be able to consolidate some of this, visualize it a little bit better, and really have an understanding of how my traffic is converting ultimately into conversions, and understanding that model to help inform my channel mix or my pub mix for that matter.
Yeah, I think that's such an important component. And, Eric, and one of the things that, from a strategic perspective that we do a lot of work with our clients on is, even prior to putting together a strategy or a campaign, is really doing assessment of what's the level of depth of insights that a brand has about its customers, right? And are they using all the resources available to really look at not only macro trends like, yes, men buy a lot of pickup trucks and construction workers and, the things like that are kind of intuitive, but there's going to be little pockets of micro insights that are equally as important, because as advertising adjusts with cookie deprecation, there's going to be a lot more opportunity to find these smaller pockets of customers that show really strong trends and insights, but pretty soon we're going to lose some of the capability to gather those insights. So one thing that we've really been pushing is to use as many resources as possible to know as much as you can about potential and new customers, because those are always changing, right? Your customer base 3 years from now could be very different than your customer base is right now. So looking at demographics, behaviors, interests, obviously things like in-market purchase signals and purchase history are very valuable pieces of information, but there's this whole halo of insights around customer bases that can really help inform some of these strategies. And again, give an advantage when we have to rely less on cookies, but a strong, set of insights about customers can almost replace that, because then you can use different mechanisms to reach them and understand them, and be able to market to them. So that's another thing that we're really pushing is, you hear about some broad audience targeting, just, males, 18 to 65. And it's like, okay, well, that's half the internet. So let's zoom in a little bit. And what kind of insights can we layer on top of that might give us some publisher indications of where we can go, right? Or some of their interests and behaviors that just take us down a couple levels and get a little bit more specific.
I think you both are hitting on a key theme, though, because we talk a lot about it is test and learn now, and that's a component of understanding a tactical approach. So what can work now? What's going to be transferable into a future state? The piece that we all also want to talk about is like learn more about your audiences while you can. You hear a lot of people say leverage third-party data while you still have it. Yeah, it drives performance, and that's great, because ultimately a lot of marketers are going to continue to be focused on performance. Corey, you talked about the value of setting aside a test budget to truly understand how to operate in a programmatic ecosystem without cookies. But I think there's going to be a major challenge, and this is just an opinion at this point, but we're going to use audience insights now. What do those audience insights become beyond? And I think that's why there's going to be such a need to continue to have Eric's talking about authenticated traffic from a publisher perspective, where if I have somebody who's, authenticating themselves, they're logging in, they're sharing that information, and I can start to pick up interests and behaviors. If it's on one domain, if it's across a network of domains where I'm able to kind of pick up different interests and behaviors that are all tied back to that same user. I mean, I think that's where you're going to see a lot of power come through with shared data sets across that browser activity. But again, it all goes back to having some level of authentication, and it removes largely a lot of guesswork that's going on today. So I'm interested to see how that plays out, because I think it all sounds really great in theory today. If I understand who my customer is today, that's useful and that's practical and it's applicable. But if I'm not taking the steps to kind of secure that from a first party relationship with them, or a common term I know is getting thrown on zero party relationship with them, is like that doesn't live on. So the importance of really understanding and getting that customer to trust you and provide that information and continue providing that information, I feel like that's a major opportunity for publishers. I mean, it feels like that's where the advantage lies in a lot of this, is still being able to maintain that valued relationship with your users and your visitors.
No, absolutely. And consumers have proven time and time again that they're willing to make that trade-off for a value proposition. I mean, that's why there's ad-supported free tiers of streaming services, right? You know that you're going to see some ads, but you're getting a cost savings. It could be something as simple as, a valuable newsletter, right? Or access to a couple of articles on your website where normally there's a paywall. And consumers are willing to make that trade-off because, first of all, it's transparent, right? They know exactly the information that they're sharing and what they're getting in exchange for that. And then second of all, it could lead to just a better customer experience down the road with that brand. Because to your point, Chris, you have a level of personalization then, right? Like if I, love to read sports articles and half of them are behind a paywall, I'm more than willing to, give them my email address and a couple other pieces of information for access to some content, right?
And one big takeaway I have is oftentimes when there's a shift in the market, we think of it as like a horse race and there's one winner. If I've heard anything, if I'm summarizing from kind of what we've discussed so far, is I think there's multiple seats at this table. It isn't a like one solution to rule them all. And so when we were talking about like understanding that audience, the way I get in front of them or the way I'm targeting or even measuring for that matter might look different throughout either the life cycle or even within a campaign itself. So we often think about the channel mix, but we also need to think about like the tactic mix. And so with that, knowing that I don't have just one single segment now that kind of covers off on everything, I'm probably breaking my line items. And Chris, you talked about splits in earlier videos, but I'm probably splitting out what these tactics are. So again, I can kind of learn or fail gracefully, depending on which way I'm measuring this. But like I have a portion here that is more contextual based, is pub based, is kind of alternative ID, and kind of so on and so forth in terms of whether it is kind of a clean room play or I'm using pair or browser topics, whatever that might be, and really kind of shooting that out against what I'm doing now. And so these don't have to be massive tests because again, we're kind of waiting on the scale because the publishers have a big lift here and we need adoption. But I can look at these side by side and get an understanding of what that traffic flow really looks like on the other side. And even if I'm not doing a full shootout, even if I'm looking at current solutions right now, and so I haven't made this big leap, I want to start taking a look at that acquisition flow. And so I'm going to lose the nice to have that is kind of view through, but I have the kind of the end result there. And I really want to take a look at my own properties and get an understanding of when I have traffic at certain levels, what does that convert by? And then understand that I have a number of tactics that are pushing that volume through. And so I begin to have at least a little bit of a mental model. Ideally, over time, you fine tune that a bit more to become a barometer to understand and kind of rationalize your media investment across channels. And again, there's different ways of testing that on the kind of on and off, or even simulating that with some of the new tools that have come out. But a lot of our benchmarks are about to be shooken up. And so that's like a tough pill to swallow, but we can do some of the groundwork now so that it isn't a kind of a race at the end here as they deprecate more and more of the cookie.
So Eric, I want to open up a question there. We'll get into a little bit more here about expectations as we move into this, and what can a lot of our customers expect, and what should marketers just expect in general, and the impact of targeting and attribution. Measurement is obviously probably the largest impacted category here, but you oversee a lot of our creative work, work very closely with our folks that are building out a lot of dynamic ads, trigger ads, whatever it might be. I know you are creative at heart, so we're talking a lot about the impact of losing some of the one-to-one targeting and measurement options, and going back towards more a traditional path here of like, what is a real media mix, doing media experimentation. So having budget up, turning budget down, turning platforms on, turning platforms off. What is the role that creative plays in all this in your eyes?
I mean, it's a huge piece, right? So that's where you're pushing your message. That's where it's a, Chris, hey, as a potential customer or a customer, I know who you are. I know what the value prop is, and I'm getting that message in front of them. But I think there's a couple of ways in which I'm looking at that, because certain ads I'm putting together for kind of like one use. I want it to strictly click through. And again, I'm kind of banking on the fact that I have that post-click attribution that's there. Other ones are awareness. That becomes kind of that fuzzier scenario. And that's kind of looking at like billboard advertising. It's like, all right, do we have a model that says by having the message out, it's keeping it top of mind, and that does in fact translate into kind of return down the line? But the other side is like, I'm looking for attention. And so we've seen a lot of different ad types come out, whether that's dynamic or all the components that come out, or the way that publishers are able to allow that experience to happen. And so you had kind of the full page takeovers, or some other unique ones where a bumper ad comes out. Again, name of the game is attention. So you have to have a strong message that correlates with what you're trying to get through to the customer. But then two, you still have that tracking to understand how are people engaging here. And so that's kind of time on unit, what components they're measuring, whether they're clicking through my carousels or making it to another scene. And so I still think you have a lot of insight you can derive and kind of A/B test through the message itself to understand if it's resonating with the market.
Yeah, and I think back to what we were saying earlier, Eric, about the insights, right? The more that you understand about your customers, the more that you can personalize that creative experience, whether it might be, pushing like a flash sale if you're in retail, or an upcoming product, in a different industry. But, all of those kind of different potential data points and insights can feed into that more personalized creative, that more effective creative, which I completely agree. I think it elevates the importance of creative even more than it has been in the past, right? Because ultimately that's the vehicle that is going to, to be able to communicate what your brand is trying to get across to customers.
I want to change gears a little bit. So we put together our point of view on the ecosystem, and there's no surprise here. We're not a FANG of the world. We leverage popular ad tech. We are fast followers, and we like to bring it into a kind of its own form for our customers. We build our own tech on top of it at times, and that's the name of the game for KORTX in a lot of different ways, just to be as accessible as possible and break through a lot of the barriers in the ecosystem for our customers. So as a shepherd of change, as a shepherd of education, we all work together. We put together kind of some thoughts around testing options for the future, whether that be authenticated traffic, leveraging commercial identifiers. Eric, you talked about some ID-free options from distilleries, a partnership that we have in place. So kind of going down the modeling path. Corey, I know you worked closely kind of with a few others just in terms of like advanced contextual solutions.
Mm-hmm.
I'd love just each of you, just your quick point of view. There's a lot of solutions out there. Do you see anything that seems to be resonating with customers, that seems to be resonating with marketers? Do you have any just words of wisdom for someone that's kind of thinking about the best way to start prioritizing these elements?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, it actually goes a level higher, Chris. One of the biggest barriers that I've seen to building success right now is a lack of coordination at the corporate level or at the brand level, right? Because a lot of times you have your creative team over here, you have your web dev team over here, a separate team that maybe manages your site tagging, a different team that manages your CRM. And a lot of times they're just not coordinated. So even just building out the fundamentals of being able to structure a test or access a data set can be incredibly difficult because it's just disparately spread across an organization. So that's one thing that I would say is, take a step back and look at how all of those components of your digital marketing foundation are built within the organization. Are there disconnects, right? Like, do you know who the gatekeepers are that can give approval to access a data set or to activate, a CRM list or things like that? So to me, that's kind of the first step, is make sure your own house is in order and that all of those people are aligned. And then once you have that, I think it's a matter of looking at all of these different options that are kind of emerging right now and zeroing in on the ones that are driving immediate success in the now with what we currently are dealing with cookie deprecation, because that's likely to be amplified moving forward. For one brand and industry, contextual might be a slam dunk, right? But for another, it might not work very well. And those are the kinds of things that need to be figured out as quickly as possible so that you can pivot into another potential testing solution, that's probably going to work better.
Eric, you got any thoughts in terms of what we're seeing right now, or where you think things are going? Nostradamus is like your role in the company a lot of times, trying to figure out what all this means. What's kind of your take right now?
I mean, you touched on fast follower, right? And so I think that can be a hard thing to navigate because no one wants to be the hero, be that early adopter that went all in on something that flopped. But I do think there's striking a balance there of saying, all right, what is kind of smart, proactive testing versus going all in? Again, I touched on the horse race. I think it's more about, instead of waiting for this one horse to win, it's like, how do we sample across what we know at least has scale at this point to begin building that model of what success looks like for us moving forward. Again, Corey touched on a huge part of this. So like, we're actively being forced to get our ducks in a row, where I had kind of my database marketing team or CRM group kind of holding this in a silo. We're seeing how a lot of these things start to merge together, and we got to play nice as a team. And so there's a couple stages there of one, the ducks in a row in terms of operations internally, and then two, kind of shooting out some of these, knowing that scale is still going to be an impact. Some of the things you can't test yet. And so it makes people uneasy knowing that we have this big change coming. I might not have access to all the things I can test, but I would say you kind of have to have that crawl, walk, run approach of slowly integrating things that I don't think are foreign to your media plan anyway. It's just kind of highlighting some of these other tactics a bit heavier and then growing on those learnings.
Yeah. I mean, I'll share an observation. I think we have two pretty clear states. Some folks are very focused on trying to solve this and trying to be in the mix and put proactive solutions in place. And Corey, you talked about a testing framework, like being very intentional to say, like, this is a test. This is what we expect to happen. The test could literally just be, we're going to implement a new line item on a campaign that uses an alternative identifier or uses more of a ID-free type approach where I'm not using cookies. And just to say, we set it up, we ran it, let's see what the result is, and let's compare it side by side of a cookie-based approach. The other side of this is I don't care. The big players are going to figure this out, and I'm just going to wait, which I think a lot of people they've been sitting through this for so long. We're going years at this point for Google to make a final decision, and we're all just kind of at the mercy of this decision. I think a lot of people have just kind of given up and said, like, tap me on the shoulder when this is all complete, and I'll figure out my world after that. So for that opinion in that group, like, do either of you have any just thoughts or care to comment on that?
I mean, who wants to take that one?
Yeah.
I have just since I came from the agency world many moons ago, but I would just say, for folks who are sitting on the other side of the desk and in a position to be able to, structure these tests and help our clients, our accounts work about our brand, I would be very apprehensive of anyone who walks in the door and says, we got it figured out. Here's our solution to cookie deprecation. Give us an IO and we're off and running, because the truth is nobody has a full solution right now. I think the best that you can do is you can work with the reality of the situation. You can aggressively test options like we are and be fast followers and really stay on top of it. But I've heard all too many stories about, I'll call them vendors, walking into an agency and saying, we figured it out. Here's our solution to, cookie deprecation, which to me, that's a huge red flag, because nobody has figured it out unless you're one of three massive companies that essentially control our industry. So I would say, keep your radar up for folks that maybe might be, pushing a little hard for something that isn't fully developed, and all of a sudden they have a magic solution that somehow Google hasn't heard of, right? Or whatever it might be. So, just do that extra level of diligence to make sure that they have your brand and your objectives and your best interest, and not just looking to make a quick transaction.
Yeah. The one thing I would add, I highly recommend against sitting on your hands during this time period. Again, I don't think anyone needs to be a hero and test because just like when AI came out, everyone changed their .com to .ai, and guess what? We're all AI companies now. You're seeing the same thing kind of happen in these targeting and measurement areas, and so I don't think you have to go out and chase every demo and try every single tactic on a plan. But we know there's a handful of tried and true things that we're trying to measure and understand our audience, and so it's just, again, kind of penciling that out. Say like, all right, here's where we've targeted them before. Here's what this persona looked like, and start to at least build that roadmap to see where some of these other tactics can fit in. So it's like, all right, here is the taxonomy we were using. How do we slowly start to replicate that either through inventory or alternative IDs? And it doesn't mean I have to race out and find 6 new identity partners. Like, some of that, the scale will kind of determine that. Again, I don't think one wins. There'll be multiple, and it'll depend on where you're trying to get in front of your audience. But I do think having a strong grasp on who your audience is, where you've had success, is at least setting kind of a foundation to allow you to test more appropriately.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Eric. And, in my personal opinion, I think that a great litmus test for that is transparency, right? Like, ask the tough questions, understand the methodology of what you're trying to get into with the partner that you're bringing on, because that's a real easy way to find out if it's smoke and mirrors or vaporware or just a quick fix that's not actually going to be a long-term solution. Folks should be able to be transparent with what they're bringing to the table, their technology, their methodology, all of that. Because if they're not, then it means that they probably haven't figured it out themselves, and they're just, duct taping a couple things together and hoping it works.
I think you both bring up some really good points, and my advice for those that have been kind of on either side is, like, I think that there is a mentality of just being curious about everything and trying to understand the options out there and understand the impacting on audience targeting and scale and the ability to manage reach and frequency. Ultimately getting down though to, like, what is this going to mean to attribution? Eric, you said it earlier on, like, we all need to really kind of change how we look at campaign success, especially in the programmatic space. Like, if I can't get to a spot where I can measure the impact of every impression that I've served across my media campaigns, I got to think a little bit more holistically at, like, if I'm dumping more water in a bucket, does that rise the water, or is it kind of falling out and dripping into different places? So having an effective kind of look at your entire campaign and your overall marketing investment, and being able to pick and choose where you're going to deploy a test in terms of a heavier investment or pulling investment out. That doesn't always sound like the most attractive kind of sexy new tech enabled approach, but a lot of times the reality of the situation is to see the impact that it has on leads or sales or foot traffic. Like, you're going to know pretty quickly. So we love to talk about programmatic execution a lot of times and get very in the weeds about it. But for a lot of, I think, our customers that we work with, like, there is more of a holistic approach to their marketing spend that they can control that also would have a very similar approach. So just a little bit more of like a general framework to thinking about how to get into testing.
Yeah, Chris, you're out on the front lines a lot talking to brands and agencies. Have you seen any trends in what, their biggest concerns are? Or is it just lack of preparedness? Is it, not really understanding the intricacies of what's happening? Or what are you seeing when you talk to brands and agencies?
I would say most don't feel like they have the luxury to test just to test.
Yeah.
We're running businesses that have revenue and profitability objectives around it. And when I'm spending $1, I need $5 to come in the door from a revenue perspective. So I think a lot of the apprehension around it isn't necessarily like it's too big, it's too complex, it's too scary, I don't know where it fits. It's more so like, is this going to have a negative impact on my Q2 earnings? Because that's a real business issue. So I think we can empathize with that. You're in a spot where we talk to a lot of mid-market brands and independent agencies, and there's just not a lot of luxury to test. But, I think the nice part about what we're offering and what a lot of other companies are offering in this space, you don't have to have significant budget to throw some of these things in a media mix and understand what the impact could be on your campaign. And like, that's why we created Split Assist. That's why programmatic splits are a thing. Like, you want to be able to incorporate a range of different inventory and audience combinations in a plan, all within like your original campaign buy. And just kind of see how those things trend up or trend down. And it's a pretty low risk opportunity. So that's kind of been my advice, Corey. I don't think there's like there's not a silver bullet. I think we've all kind of come to that realization. And a lot of us, I think there's the ability to feel like you don't have any control of the situation, but I think you do. I think you can take it in a much more proactive mindset, like we've discussed, throughout this conversation today.
Yeah. One thing I always like to remind myself and that we talk about with our customers is that at the end of the day, regardless of what happens over the next 6, 12, 18 months, whatever it is, your customers are still going to be there. Your brand is still going to be right here. It's just the way that we interact with them and, engage with them is going to have to evolve. But it doesn't mean that your customer base is going anywhere, right? It just means that we're going to have to figure out more innovative ways to speak to them and engage with them.
I think we should all really embrace the challenge. Because like, for every new emerging media type that comes out, it's going to cause a change in consumer behavior. I think a prime example right now is like the fact that Gen Z primarily leverages like Snapchat and TikTok as their primary search engine, and that's their source of truth. Like, we all have to shape how our messaging is going to go out and how brands want to interact with users in that way. So I think it creates a lot of exciting opportunities. Obviously, change is scary and I think can cause some concern, but there's a lot of really smart people in this industry, in this ecosystem, and I don't think we're going to be in a spot where we can't still deliver effective marketing programs.
Yeah, exactly.
Guys, I appreciate the time. Are there any closing thoughts that you'd care to leave?
I just think on my side, this becomes a ongoing conversation. And so hopefully everyone enjoyed the kind of break room talk around what we're thinking of, what we're hearing, and how we kind of plan to attack that. But I imagine this is one of many conversations that we have as this evolves.
Yeah, I would just say that, personally, I think the way to look at this is opportunity. Like you were saying, Chris, with every new technology, every evolution of our industry, ultimately you can look at it as a negative and something to be worried about, or you could look at it as an opportunity and an advantage, right? And I think the ones that do that are the ones that are going to ultimately be more successful.
Yeah. To me, it's one more opportunity to look at key partnerships and pulling teams. Corey, you mentioned it, cross department or cross functions, like groups that didn't work together or maybe had reasons to not work together. it's like that's really not going to be an option anymore, especially if we want to have a cohesive approach. And that's kind of within brand walls or agency walls. And then even agencies that are working with one another. You know, I think there's some folks that do amazing creative work. There's others that have awesome design elements on websites, and like they just know what the right user journey is for higher education versus CPG. It's like these are the opportunities for, I think, some unique partnerships to also form. So it'll be fun to watch in the coming months. Guys, thank you both for the time. For everybody who's tuned in, we hope you enjoyed a little bit of a look into some conversations that are going on at KORTX.